Welcome to Lesson 11 in Search for Truth. I'm really happy to have you with me in this moment as we explore even further the life of Abram. So we know that Abram, based on Lesson 10, was given this directive by God to go to a land that God would reveal and to consecrate himself, to enter into covenant, so that both he and the generations that would come after him in his lineage would have this sacred promise that existed between them and God, that they would inherit land, that they would be great on the earth, that they would be a blessed people, that they would be the lineage through whom the Messiah eventually comes to extend that umbrella to encompass anybody in the future who wants to be a part of it. So it's a sacred journey that he's taking. And one of the directives that God gives him is, leave your father's house. Don't look over your shoulder, essentially. Just go. Now, of course, Sarai, his wife, was going to be permitted to accompany him, but that should have been the extent of it. Unfortunately, Abram took his nephew Lot. And as we jump into it, we're going to jump into this portion of the story to just really explore the domino effect that happened as a result of tilting that first one, of not being thoroughly obedient to the directive to leave everything behind. So they enter into this journey. They bring their herdsmen, all of their goods that would be necessary for this kind of trip. And Lot and his flocks and herds, as well as Abram's, begin to rapidly multiply. And unfortunately, quarrels start to develop over their livestock. And these quarrels are between the herdsmen, and it gets to this mounting point where they realize we've got to part ways. We can't actually move forward any longer. So a decision point comes into play here. And in this act of generosity, being a diplomatic sort, Abram offers Lot first choice. Now, one would probably be fair to say that perhaps Lot should not have jumped to take that first choice, and maybe it would have been respectful to turn that about and allow, being the elder person, being the one who was leading, in a sense, this journey, Abram to choose. But indeed, he did not. He seized that opportunity. And as they're standing on this ridge and they're just looking out over the geography, to the east lay this beautiful and plenteous land. It was well watered, it was wide, it was in the plain of the Jordan River, and it was rich. There was vegetation, the land produced. And it feels to Lot like this is a pretty good bet. To the west, there's hill country, and maybe in appearances that didn't seem nearly as spectacular. The eastern land, however, had an issue. That was where Canaan's wicked descendants dwelled. And there were 5 cities in that plain that they occupied. Now, you may recall from earlier studies in this series that we talked about that name, Canaan. That name came into play during Noah's journey. You recall that his son Ham, in some sort of way, embarrassed him when he was compromised by having a bit too much of the bubbly following being cooped up in the ark and learning how to create vineyards. And for whatever reasons, Ham did something, and while the Bible's not explicit about it, he did something that brought shame to his father and ultimately shame to himself. But the actual curse was passed on to Ham's descendants, of which Canaan was one. And so we're talking about those, if you will, cursed people, those people who would ultimately be subservient and serve the older brothers. And so we're looking at a very difficult situation culturally, spiritually. These are people who have lost all moorings. These are individuals that are running by their own rules. And in running by their own rules, you know that if you're going to enter that land, there's going to be moral compromise galore. But selfishly, Lot chose what to him visually looked like the good land. He chose the plains of the Jordan, and he put himself near the absolutely immoral cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And this was going to prove to be a terrible mistake in his life. Let's journey forward a little bit more. We're going to read Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 to 17. I have these in the New King James Version available for us. So in Genesis chapter 13, starting at verse 14, it says this, "And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, 'Lift your eyes now, and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered.'" And we know that's an impossible task. We never could number that. "Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you." I am sure that this is a necessary comfort that Abram has to hear, because not only has he dragged Lot into this, but Lot has made a faulty decision. And in not obeying that voice, we're seeing already a grace from God to still speak with Abram at this point, and say, "I'm with you. I'm doing something in and through you. And where you are right now is beautifully situated. Everything that you're looking out on is what I'm going to give you." And perhaps in that moment, it didn't look nearly as verdant and rich as the land that Lot had chosen. But this was Abram's land. And this was going to be the land for his descendants for many, many generations to come. Let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's talk about where Lot found himself. Years pass. He, his wife, his 2 daughters, they've settled into the lands. And he becomes so deeply entrenched in all of the happenings of his city. It was to such a degree that the Bible actually says he was listed as sitting in its gate. Now, that term, to sit in the city gates, basically means that he had a position of power. Whether it was political, whether it was just the fact that he had some sort of title, or maybe a decent spit of the land, or perhaps he was affluent, whatever that meant, it meant he carried a measure of gravitas, of authority. And so he is quite entangled in everything that's happening in that city. I want us to take a peek at a verse in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 gives us, I think, some insight that's really applicable to what we're going to get into for the remainder of this study, but also it applies to the entire Old and New Testament in totality. So when we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, it says, "All these things." Now, what are these things? All these things that we read about in the scripture, all these things that we've been taught about, all of these points in history in which humans did poorly or humans did well, all that encompasses, it says all these things happened to them, these people, these characters that we're reading about, as examples. And they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. I'm going to actually read the next verse, verse 12. "Therefore," so in light of this fact, in light of the fact that everything that we read about in Scripture is supposed to be an example to us, and it's for our admonition. It's admonishing us, it is teaching us, it is warning us, it is attempting to shape us in a direction to help us to learn the lessons, to not fall victim to the same mistakes. It says, therefore, in light of all of this, in light of the fact that we are at the end of the age, meaning Time is as short as it's ever been, and each day that passes brings us closer to God's ultimate judgment on humanity. So if we're the ones who sit here at the end of things, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. What does that mean? It means be careful thinking that you have it all together. Be careful thinking that you're always going to make the right decision. Be careful in getting so pompous that you believe you've got this. 100% of the time, I've got this. I hold this down. Everything's going to be fine. I know what I'm doing. How many times when we were young people did we say that? I know what I'm doing. And we, in fact, did not. Lot becomes a severe warning to us about making snap decisions based on what seems attractive in the moment, but not thinking about the far-reaching effects that are going to play out in our lives as a result of that decision. So moving forward just a little bit more, and you'll see the reference to Genesis 19 is there, Genesis 19, 1 to 28. It's going to be really important for you to read as part of your personal study. But, Lot didn't just choose that plane for himself. He chose it for his wife, and he chose it for his children, his 2 daughters. We need to be careful because if exposing family members to an evil environment proves to be tragic for Lot, then his example, you know how it says there that all of these things are told as an example to us and to admonish us, to warn us? His example should alert every parent, every leader, every Christian in our day to be so careful. We often fool ourselves into thinking that the lives that we currently live only affect us. But in reality, every human being has the capacity to butt up against another human being and create effect. Even when I don't think I'm being watched, I probably am. Even when I don't think that people know who I am and what I'm up to when nobody is there to witness it, there's probably some chink in my armor that I am completely unaware of that has exposed me. It says in the scripture that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, whatever is going on under the surface is eventually going to make itself known. It'll make itself known in language, in behavior, in life decisions, in career paths, in who you choose to keep company with, who you choose to entangle yourself in deeper relationships with, how you choose to worship if you choose to worship. All of these things are ripples that often start from one point of carelessness. So we need to be so careful because if I have eyes looking at me, I have the responsibility that my life becomes a living example of what is acceptable and what is not. If I permit myself to do it, am I entirely comfortable if somebody else, based on what they've seen me do, reflects that behavior and decides it's good for them too? These are like seeds that are being buried deep into the ground, and at some point, they will bear fruit. The question is it sweet or is it bitter? In the case of Lot, he has buried his family in Sodom and Gomorrah with no consideration and has gone so far as to become entrenched in the lifestyle of that particular culture. And he doesn't realize it is a bitter, bitter plant that's going to actually spring up. Now, these 3 angelic visitors come to Abram's tent, and they bring glad news and terrifying news. First, they bring a renewal of the promise of this long-awaited son that's going to happen in Abram and Sarai's old age. So that's a blessed thing. That's good news. That's something we can wrap our arms around. But next, they tell him that a doomsday event is on the horizon, that the cities of the plain, where he knows good and well, his nephew has taken up residence in, are going to be destroyed because God has had enough of the shenanigans that are happening in that area. how difficult it must have been for Abraham to have such joyous news and such horrific and nightmarish news mingled in the same conversation. So what happens in this moment? Abram begins to immediately plead for Sodom to be spared. If 50 righteous souls, and this is the encounter that he has with God, if 50 righteous souls can be identified, would you delay the punishment? Would you spare the city long enough? Yeah, God agrees. But what about 40, 30, 10? His answer is yes each time. The intercession of Abram with God in this prayer, where God actually answers back, was honored. Let me say to you that this is probably one of the most beautiful negotiations that we actually see in Scripture. Why? Abram doesn't really have a reason to try and engage God in this manner. Lot caused him a lot of trouble. Lot's herdsmen caused him a lot of trouble. And sure, he started it and allowed him to come with him on the journey when he probably should not have. But though he's kin, it is quite unlikely that they've seen each other in some time. Only that Abraham is aware that he's there. He begins this spoken conversation, this actual exchange with God, which really is a powerful example of what prayer can look like. This back forth, this dialogue, where the Almighty and humanity can come together and speak these things. And it's interesting because one of the ways in which the Scripture records that this encounter happened is that God says, "Should I withhold from my friend Abraham what I intend to do?" Wow. Abraham, the friend of God. I want to be a friend of God, and I'm sure that you do as well. I want to have that kind of relationship where God can tell me his mind, where he can give me that warning shot when things are about to change, where he gives me the breathing space to be able to verbalize my worries and my concerns for other people, for people that I love. Make sure that you are always in your prayer time taking time to intercede on behalf of people that mean something to you, and intercede on behalf of the stranger. You may very well be the only one having conversations about these people with God. And surely in the life of Lot, this is the only voice that cried out on his behalf when he made his foolhardy decision to land himself somewhere. And if you ever find yourself to be the recipient of the blessing and the mercy and the sparing of God, make sure you understand that you may have some debts of gratitude to those around you that also prayed for you and lifted your name up to God. So this negotiation happens, and what's interesting is I've told you that the only people who are there are Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters. Abraham negotiates down to 10, maybe because it's been some time and he doesn't know how much the family might have grown. Perhaps the daughters are married, maybe they have children. There's not even that many. And yet still, God gives this amazing running start and this rescue. Why did God inform Abraham of his intentions to destroy Sodom? Because they were blood covenant partners, and that meant something. That was counted towards Abraham as being worthy of conversation. When you're in covenant, when you're in bond with God, when you're centering God in your life and you're respecting his role as being leader, as being guide, as being the divine who should be respected and honored and feared, when you're putting God in that place and you're listening to that voice and you're following where it's leading you, that means something. And that bond opens doors to be able to communicate. There are so many precious stories I could exhaust us with of individuals that I've known personally who God gave the script ahead of time to, gave them insight, showed them things that they naturally would never have known. And it was because they were partners with God. They were giving themselves wholly to whatever God's cause was in their life. Abraham's an amazing example of this. So the angels, they go to Sodom and they find Lot. And they accept his accommodations for the evening in his home. But during the night, what is so disturbing is that the men of the city actually surrounded the house and demanded that Lot release these strangers that they've not seen before to them so that they might know them. This is biblical language for wanting to have an intimate encounter with them that was completely inappropriate. To think that these people of the city were so lost in their immorality that they couldn't even sense the holiness that was in the room. Be very careful about making sure that you always respect holy things. Do not be cavalier, do not be casual, do not be crude when it concerns the things of God, His Word, His name, facts about Him, His character. Be so careful that you do not mishandle those things. In this particular case, the citizens were not making a case for themselves. They were mishandling in honestly an atrocious way the holiness that was in their area. In his folly, Lot actually offers his own daughters to these people, these base, immoral people, instead, to try and protect the angels, as if the angels actually needed protecting. But still, this is what he does. And to protect themselves and ultimately his daughters, the angels temporarily blinded the men so that they could not find the door of the house to be able to hassle them anymore. I want you to really consider the landslide that Lot has found himself in. Totally buried to the brain. Because it would never be rational for any father to think that this was a trade. But that city and its ways clearly had gotten the better of him. He should be involved in protecting his family. He should be involved in making sure that he always is a buffer between his precious daughters and the rest of the world. But instead, he's offering them like lambs for the slaughter to protect what he thought was holy. And the truth is, in his eyes, his family should have been equally as sacred and worthy of being defended. But this is what happens when you and I do not operate in wisdom. When we're not walking by faith, we're walking by sight. When we're seeking accolades and we're pursuing accomplishments, and we don't realize that we're sacrificing the sacred for the pursuit of selfish ambition. This is what Lot did. In his selfish ambition, he lost sight of what needed protecting and what should have been cherished and what should have been to him the most important thing. And lest you and I ever think that we can't fall into the same demise, trust me, there are plenty of points in my life where I've done things I couldn't believe I did. And I'm sure you can say the same thing. We all have the potential of being blinded. We all have the potential of going too far out to sea. Lot has done this, and now the father is giving up his daughters. Thank goodness for the angels taking command of the situation to make sure that that didn't happen. So, after Lot has been warned of the imminent destruction, he was still reluctant to leave. The angels had to seize him and his wife and his two daughters and forcefully escort them from the city and forbade them to even look back. Now, when I say look back, it's not even just the casting of a glance over the shoulder. It's that look of longing that causes a person to abandon their exit and turn back to what is familiar, returning to the city. This was important. They were not to do this. Well, what ends up happening is the region itself was known to have numerous slime and asphalt pits. Petroleum deposits can still be found there to this day. And throughout history, I can tell you that this plain has actually been the scene of earthquakes and various kinds of natural phenomenon. And so I do suspect that there were not only miraculous elements that were employed, but probably geological activity that was also harnessed and were likely the force that caused this destruction to happen. And so all of this begins to erupt and everything begins to burn. And in the midst of the horror, and no doubt the noise rising from these cities, these twin cities, must have been unbelievable. But Lot's wife disobeys the angel's command by not only looking back, but going back. I'd like us to look at a passage in the Gospels, in the book of Luke. I'm going to turn there on my device, but Luke chapter 17, and we're going to read verses 28 to 32. And here's what it says. It says, likewise, and this is Jesus speaking in this moment, likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, he who is on the housetop and his goods are in the house, let him not come down to take them away. And likewise the one who's in the field, let him not turn back. And then there are these haunting words that finish verse 32. It simply says, remember Lot's wife. That's a boding statement. And Jesus makes a comparison to this moment in history and the moments that are yet to come in the future when we deal with the end times and we deal with the world coming under judgment. He paints a portrait that the manner in which people conducted themselves was largely the same. They were doing business as usual. They were acquiring, they were spending, they were enjoying, they were feasting. But then the destruction came. Then the moment in which they have to pay the piper comes. And he specifically says, don't bother taking anything with you. Don't bother trying to grab at items and objects and things that you took comfort in and you derive status from. Don't bother. Because that's not what's going to help you. He even says, remember Lot's wife. Who knows? We're not given a whole bunch of information about what happened, but who knows if she remembered something that she deemed precious enough to risk her life for and go back for. Jesus says, abandon it all. Let it go. It's not useful for you. These things that weigh you and I down, it says in the scripture, we need to lay aside every weight and the sin that so often besets us. It's scripture that's actually painting a portrait of what it looks like to run a race and how one has to shed. You have to be as light as possible to be able to run with the strength and the vigor and the endurance that's needed to get to the end of that race. You and I have got to shed. We need to not be picking up things that become strongholds and strangle grips on us. We don't need that. We need to be as light as possible, moving through this world, not accumulating sediment in our soul, not allowing ourselves to be distracted by things that take us off course. We need to be able to cut and run when God says cut and run. We need to avoid the judgment. We need to avoid the destructions that are surely coming. Remember Lot's wife. So what ends up happening? She was likely killed in the upheaval. She was encrusted, we're going to guess, in maybe a nitrous and saline substance that temporarily preserved her from decay. And that would be very similar to what happened to the victims of Pompeii. It says in the scripture she was turned into a pillar of salt. So whatever it was, it seems to have petrified her in a sense and retained her form. That's frightening. That's absolutely frightening. This is what happened. But the story doesn't end there. And I won't promise that this particular Bible study is a cheerful earful, and I'm sorry for that, but these warnings are important too. Once they escaped, Lot and his daughters went to Zoar, and they fled into the mountain caves and tried to hold up shop temporarily there, of course having lost everything except the clothes on their back. And in this primitive and crude space, the daughters conspired to make their father drunk and to commit incest. This resulted in each of them giving birth to a son. Now, I want us to just kind of pause there to consider this. It is likely that the daughters felt this was the end of the world as they knew it. They likely felt that all of their prospects were gone. They were extremely short-sighted and didn't see what could possibly come next to create any measure of normalcy for them because they've lost everything. Beware of desperate moves that you make when you think that your back is against the wall. The choices that you and I make when we go into emergency mode are usually not the choices that we would make if we took enough time to consider our options. But I think we sometimes hear a clock ticking in the background that makes us feel frantic and makes us feel like we have to rush into whatever the next phase is and just go for it. I can tell you, very few of my best decisions have ever been shooting from the hip. Some of the best decisions of my life were when I gave myself the time and didn't give in to the false pressure that I needed to decide now. Lot's daughters, of course, would not have had any great moral input living in the space of Sodom and Gomorrah. The fact that their father was willing to sell them down the river to protect the angels who appeared as men to them would have probably compounded this. But they've learned dangerous lessons. They've learned to manipulate and they've learned to be base. Again, it is a warning and a woe to all of us who have anybody under our authority or under our influence to make sure that we are not dishing out poisoned food into their lives. These children that each girl delivered, a son apiece, these boys later formed two nations, Moab and Ammon. And both of these nations become historically hostile enemies of God's chosen people. So you see that ripple effect that starts from not listening to get out and get away from all of your family and go on this journey, you and I, now translates to, and now we have actual enemies that are going to come onto the playing field in the future, and this is going to cause years upon years of hardship. We need to understand that everything touches something else. And while it would be lovely to say that there are some things that we can do and the grace of God meets us and repercussions avoid us, that's not always reality. And sometimes things are unfortunately going to have a domino effect and knock several others down. Lot, as 1 Corinthians says, is certainly given to us as an example. His life becomes for us a big, big siren sounding in the night to warn us that there are some places we need to make sure we don't go. Be careful, and as you go through your week, take some time and pray and ask the Lord, is there anything I am doing? Is there any place I am going? And is there any company I'm keeping that is not your best for my life? Is there something I could be doing better to honor you and to make sure that my covenant is always the first thing that I'm thinking about, that bond between you and I sits as the most important aspect of my life? These things are critical. And if the story of our lives is going to be told at any point, I'm sure you and I want to make sure it's a good one. Thank you so much for joining me for Lesson 11. I look forward to teaching you 12 and wish you all of God's best. Take care.